Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. We are continuing today with, we are going to be discussing Malcolm X and his life of redemption and how he reinvented himself over the years and how he kind of rose up from some very difficult situations to become perhaps the greatest civil rights leader of all time when it comes to the civil rights of African Americans in the United States and across the world in reality, because his words live on. And what he really did was incredible for Black people. And he had a very different approach, more of a caustic approach, more of an unfiltered approach than leaders such as Martin Luther King. But his words impacted people just as greatly. And this topic is especially important now because of what's been happening with obviously the George Floyd death and by police officers and things that have been happening in the United States and across the world for years now. And this is the first time when Black people's voices are starting to become heard for these serious issues, and there are international protests, not just restricted to national ones within the United States. And this has been, I believe this will be instrumental for change. And this is a time, it's a sad time, and a lot of things have been compiling onto us with obviously the coronavirus and this as well. But this kind of triggered my interest back into Malcolm X and to some civil rights leaders and their words, because their words really apply to what's been happening today. And every time something like this happens, you can turn to these guys. And I turned to the autobiography of Malcolm X and how he got through difficult situations to become such a strong fighter for Black empowerment and for just for the basic civil rights of African Americans. And I believe this is an important topic to talk about today. So that's what we're going to do. Who was Malcolm X? Malcolm X was an African American civil rights hero who spoke out about Black pride and Black nationalism in the early 1960s and a little bit before that as well. What is Black nationalism? What is this approach that Malcolm used? So Black nationalism seeks to promote and develop the Black race identity for the purposes of empowering African Americans. So some of the quotes from Malcolm X, for instance, are that show this kind of nationalistic approach to empower Black people are, nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. So he kind of was about putting issues into your own hands, and in a way, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. But although he did obviously acknowledge that it was more difficult than this, but taking the power into your own hands as a Black man who has been oppressed and taking your freedom. Nobody's going to give it to you. And frankly, it's been stolen from you. So let's take it back is kind of what Malcolm was saying. And he also said, concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks. So obviously you can see how this is far from the turn the other cheek mentality or something like that, or a more docile approach. He says, we shouldn't teach men to not to defend themselves if they're victims to these brutal attacks. So again, take control of yourself, and we have to be able to stand up for ourselves, whatever it takes, is kind of what he preached. And another quote is, a race of people is like an individual man. Unless it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, expresses its own culture, affirms its own selfhood, it can never fulfill itself. So he's talking about the black race and how it's kind of like an individual man in a sense, and you have to take your talents generally as a member of a race and your history and your culture, and you have to be able to express these things and affirm your own selfhood. Only then will you be able to prosper. So this is that Black nationalist approach, and really a serious empowerment he talked about for Black people. So you can clearly see this black pride and this black power that he preached, and about taking matters into your own hands when it comes to adversity, being strong in the face of this adversity. These incredibly strong words directly influenced parties like the Black Panther Party, which was actually formed in the immediate wake of Malcolm X's assassination. So the Black Panthers, for those who don't know, were a black nationalist civil rights organization that spawned immediately after Malcolm X's assassination in 1965, and they kind of continued this train of empowering black people. So let's kind of go back and talk about where it all started for Malcolm, and how did he get to this point, especially being so downtrodden early in life? Because by the end of this, you're going to see how he was able to come out of these difficult situations early on and rise up to be one of the greatest, frankly, one of the greatest black men ever in many people's books. Malcolm X, it's an interesting name. It's not his name he was born with. He's Malcolm Little is the name he was born with, but the X replaced the slave master name of Little, which had been imposed by his paternal forebears, is what he says in the book. So as part of the Nation of Islam, which he joined after, or actually while he was in prison and immediately after leaving prison, they replaced their last names with an X. Again, kind of like an empowering move to say, I'm not going to be tied down by a slave master's name. And the X kind of signifies it's unknown what my initial name was before our family was brought here on slave ships, but we're going to use the X. And it wasn't just Malcolm X. There were like quite a few who adopted this X as their last name in the Nation of Islam. But we're going to use this X to kind of empower ourselves and to show we're not going to adopt just some any old name that's just been passed down. Malcolm X fought through a lot of obstacles early in life. So he had incredibly difficult beginnings, starting with some of his family life just as a child. So his family experienced death threats from members of a group called the Black Legion, and they were going to kill Malcolm's father and Malcolm's family if they didn't leave town. And I believe this was when they were in Michigan. He was born in Nebraska, and I actually can't remember that 100%, but I believe this is when they were in Lansing, Michigan. These things happened. They also had their house burned down by two racist men, completely burned down. And Malcolm X's father died also when he was 6. So it was suspected among the town that his father was attacked and left for dead by some of these racists or the Black Legion, and left for dead on the train tracks because his body was actually found in half from a train. But it was ruled a suicide, so the insurance company did not want to pay Malcolm's family after the death. So just another hurdle on top of the already difficult situation. And this kind of led to his mother's mental breakdown, which she suffered, and she was institutionalized in a mental hospital for the rest of her life. So what Malcolm says in the book is kind of what he thought about this kind of later on is he says, knowing that my mother was in there as a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion, I have no mercy or compassion for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under their own weight. So this quote greatly applies to what's been happening today and what continues to happen, especially in the United States, of especially black people who are so downtrodden, and there's so much economic disparity there, and they live in such a difficult is an understatement if you are poor and black in America. Such a difficult world. And they're being killed by police, and they are being put down and discriminated against for things that they have no control over. The only reason is because they're poor and black in America. And Malcolm says this is why he kind of developed this ideology of having no compassion for society that crushes people down due to systemic racism and serious discrimination, and then penalizes them for not being able to stand up under the weight. This is kind of where Malcolm developed kind of this animosity towards this difficult world that he had experienced from a young age. From his mother's mental breakdown, now he has no parent to care for him, and this puts him into foster care. So this, although foster care seems like, oh, now he has a home and he's accepted somewhere, but he also talks about in the book how this provided even some great difficulties as well. He says, my foster parents would talk in the same way people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. They would use the N-word as though I wasn't there, as if I wouldn't understand what the word meant. It just never dawned upon them that I could understand, that I wasn't a pet, but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensitivity, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it has historically been the case. Even though we might be with them, we aren't considered of them. Even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they did not really see me. In this quote, incredibly detailed and quite self-explanatory, showing how Malcolm from an early age felt that white America generally just did not see him for who he was, and no matter what his great propensities or skills were or who he was, everyone kind of looked past him and would say these discriminatory things as if he wasn't there, as if he didn't really understand, and this was difficult to be looked upon this way, as if he was a pet. And I believe the chapter of the book is called Canary, and just about how he was not really treated as if he was a boy, but more of a pet in a sense. Now, this kind of low perception of Malcolm extended to his schooling, and the low expectations were imposed on him by actually teachers. So Malcolm X, he was actually very smart from a young age, and he was actually the class president and actually a tremendous student. But a teacher told him in the 8th grade that he should be a carpenter, and instead of, I can't remember exactly what he had said to that teacher that he wanted to be, but immediately the teacher wrote it off and said, be a carpenter, because thinking of being, it was a lawyer. Thinking of being a lawyer was foolish for a Negro. So these are the low expectations imposed on Malcolm from an early age, and it's not just Malcolm; it's a lot of Black people in America. It's such a development for the poor Black youth because they have nobody to tell them that they could be something great, and let alone they have no one to tell them that they could be something great. And people are also putting them down and saying that not only can they not become something great, but they should probably settle for something more mediocre. Now, there was also the problem of poor role models for Malcolm. So an incredible quote, again in the book, is Malcolm X kind of talks about how the ghetto hustler was perceived as someone to look up to. So when you're poor in the ghetto, there's really no one to look up to. No one's become a doctor. No one's become a lawyer. You've really no one to look up to. And what these little kids end up looking up to are these hustlers who are doing whatever they can to survive in the negative environment that was imposed upon them. So Malcolm says what makes the ghetto hustler yet more dangerous is his glamour image to the school dropout youth in the ghetto. These ghetto teenagers see the hell caught by their parents struggling to get somewhere, or see that they have given up struggling in the prejudiced, intolerant world. The ghetto teenagers make up their own minds that they would rather be like the hustlers whom they see dressed sharp and flashing money and displaying no respect for anybody or anything. So the ghetto youth become attracted to the hustlers' world of dope, thievery, prostitution, and general crime and immorality. So the ghetto, this kind of perpetuates this difficult cycle for the Black youth, especially in America, in poor areas, because their role models simply are not should not be role models, but because they're in such a bad environment, that's just who they look up to. I mean, it's hard for a little kid to choose the right role model. If he sees this person flashing money and is having success in a difficult environment, maybe that's who I should try to become. And there's a lot of psychology research about how role models really impact the way who you want to become and what you do become in the end. It's important to have strong role models. And with poor kids in the ghetto, sometimes that simply does not exist. And that's what Malcolm was made clear to Malcolm. There's also the problem of a lack of opportunity. Okay, so even if you're not looking up to any negative role models, do you even have the opportunity to make it out of the ghetto? So he talks about a friend named West Indian Archie who had many talents, but he could not put them to appropriate use because of the situation he was in. So West Indian Archie, he says, had the kind of photographic memory that put him among the elite of numbers runners. These are playing like gambling, illegal gambling or numbers games, they called it in Harlem. He never wrote down your number. He was able to file all the numbers in his head and write them down for the banker only when he turned in his money. This made him the ideal runner because cops could never catch him with any betting slips. He says, I've often reflected upon such black veteran numbers men as West Indian Archie. If they had lived in another kind of society, their exceptional mathematical talents might have been better used, but they were black. So just the issue of being black in America, it doesn't allow you to climb the ladder in a lot of ways. And Malcolm just mentions, but they were black in this case. But also he's having the issue of growing up in such a negative environment. And this may have been because they were black and because of obviously slavery and then the imposed Jim Crow laws that held the newfound freedom of slaves back, and they became sharecroppers, and the white men still were getting all of the money and the black people were still in poverty. And these are the ancestors of the West Indian Archies and the Malcolm X's who it's hard when you start so many steps back to climb up to a decent position. And these are the barriers that are imposed on black people in America. And that has to be realized when people, kind of like the quote Malcolm was talking about when he says, when he's talking about his mother and how society crushes people and then penalizes them for not being able to stand up under their own weight, and penalizes them when they find whatever, and they find drugs or marijuana and they lock them up for their whole life and things like this. And that's what they had to do to survive in a lot of cases, but they're penalized for just trying to survive in such a negative environment that they did not have control over. Okay, and this is that lack of opportunity. They resort to numbers running. They resort to things that are not conducive to overall success in life, and it's very short term, it's very tunnel vision, and often there's nothing they can do because of such a lack of opportunity, because of things they can't control. Now, how did Malcolm X start to find redemption, guys? You can see he experienced so much negativity and difficult hurdles in his life. How did he become such an important figure if these were all the things he was going through? Now, it didn't start right away. What actually triggered it was going to prison for burglary in 1946 at the age of 20. Malcolm was hustling, kind of like West Indian Archie in Harlem, for years, and he found himself in prison for burglary. So he spent 6 years in there. Now, what he found in there, he befriended a man who introduced him to the library. And what was interesting in this prison was that they had open access to the library. They could go in and out, grab whatever books, or at least Malcolm did, as far as I can remember from the book. And he began to read an extremely broad array of subjects And he eventually centered himself onto issues with civil rights and things about African Americans and Black people. So he says, I read aimlessly until I learned to read selectively with a purpose. He started to read with a purpose, and this became very instrumental in totally shaping Malcolm's mind. And so another quote, he says, many who today hear me somewhere in person or on television, or those who read something I've said, will think I went to school far beyond the 8th grade. This impression is due entirely to my prison studies. Malcolm X dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and he started hustling on the streets and living a life of crime. But in prison, just reading and changing his mind totally turned Malcolm into this incredibly erudite and incredibly articulate speaker. Okay. And I find it so incredible that just reading books can change somebody that much. This is the importance of education. Malcolm actually says, one of his quotes is, without education, you're not going anywhere in this world. Without that stimulus into your brain, to allow your mind to grow and expand and to learn about the condition of things around you, and you're not going anywhere, because what education does is it gives you a set of spectacles to look through onto the world. And whatever subject you learn, you look at the world through those spectacles from your education. And so what you read is important. What we take in is important, guys. This is almost like a recurring theme of ITP, because we've talked about it in a few episodes now of how what we take into our minds really shapes us. So be wary of what you take into your minds. And that's what Malcolm X did in prison. He learned to read selectively with a purpose. And he says, let me tell you something. In every free moment I had, if I was not reading in the library, I was reading on my bunk. You couldn't have gotten me out of books with a wedge. Months passed without my even thinking about being imprisoned. In fact, up to then, I had never been so truly free in my life. And what an incredible quote from a man in prison who says, I found freedom now that I am locked up. Okay, this is a quote that you hear a lot in hip hop, is they can lock my body but can't lock my mind. So this applied so greatly to Malcolm. And he also has he says, an English writer telephoned me from London asking questions. One was, what was your alma mater? Okay, and he says, I told him books. And he said, you will never catch me with a free 15 minutes in which I'm not studying something I feel might be able to help the Black man. So Malcolm, he really took advantage of these books in this library and education. He educated his mind, and this is where he began to redeem himself. Now, it was not a complete turnaround right from prison. One issue, although he did begin to rise up after his release from prison due to this self-education, he was not fully on the right track, but he was making great progress and this is when he essentially became famous as a civil rights leader in America. So immediately after these 6 years in jail, he spent 12 years in the Nation of Islam. So as a free man, he went on to be in the Nation of Islam, which was led by Elijah Muhammad, who essentially was preaching a false religion to a lot of Black people in America, but it was very effective for empowering them. And a lot of the quotes Malcolm X has said, you kind of have to parse through it, because a lot of the things he said were very essentially racist against a lot of the white people. And he actually adopted a little bit of this racist ideology that he so vehemently opposed coming from white people. So he actually quite often referred to white people as the devil. Quite unfortunately, in this, and this is why a lot of people have not kind of wanted to further Malcolm's reputation, and even he says for the funeral, well, he doesn't say this obviously, but for the funeral in the afterword, it says no church really wanted to accept him in there, and there was only like a couple preachers who would do the funeral, because he said things like this. And although he was incredibly instrumental, and a lot of his quotes are just as good as that one is bad, he did suffer from a little bit of this racist ideology, and but he still spoke out against these without restraint, is what Malcolm did most greatly. He spoke without restraint against the injustices of African Americans. But he did, of course, hold this negative attitude against white people, making him far more controversial than leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. So some of his more caustic approach are in examples in these quotes. So he says, "Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery." This is far from the turn your other cheek mentality in Christianity. And as a matter of fact, he actually often viewed the Christian philosophy as overly docile and submissive and inadequate, ultimately, for the purposes of Black people gaining civil rights. So he certainly wasn't so well respected among many of the Christians at the time. Another quote he says is, "We are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us." Again, none of this turn the other cheek. This is, if you're violent, we have the right to become violent with you and stand up for ourselves. It was more of a strong approach, a militant approach, a Black nationalist approach that he really was preaching, especially as a member of the Nation of Islam. Now, he began to redeem himself. This life of redemption, it really started to turn around when he left the Nation of Islam. And this is only in the last year of his life, when his ideology became less extreme and his philosophy became more accepting of all people, Black or white. So he says in the book, "The sickness and the madness of those days in the Nation of Islam, I'm glad to be free of them." He began to find real Islam and became a real Muslim, not just a member of the Nation of Islam. And he says, "I feel like a man who has been asleep somewhat and under someone else's control. I feel like what I'm thinking and saying is now for myself, because it was for and by the guidance of Elijah Muhammad before. Now I think with my own mind." Okay. In the last year of his life, he finally started to break ties with the Nation of Islam and to find his own way. And no more of the all praise is due to Elijah Muhammad, the leader who kind of brought him under his wing after prison. He has now found himself, okay? I think with my own mind now, he says. So this is the final chapter of Malcolm's life, because it did unfortunately come to an abrupt end due to this. After this fracture with members of the Nation of Islam, they hunted him down, and they were hunting him down for a very long time, and the FBI did not take Malcolm X's complaint seriously, and they eventually did assassinate Malcolm in 1965 in February. But prior to this, he did live out this final chapter, and this more accepting chapter, guys, and what he says is, "Awareness came surging up in me, how deeply the religion of Islam had reached down into the mud to lift me up, to save me from being what I inevitably would have been, a dead criminal in a grave, or, if still alive, a flint-hard, bitter, 37-year-old convict in some penitentiary or insane asylum. Or at best, I would have been an old, fading Detroit Red, hustling, stealing enough for food and narcotics, and myself being stalked as prey by cruelly ambitious younger hustlers such as Detroit Red had been. But Allah had blessed me to learn about the religion of Islam, which had enabled me to lift myself up from the muck and the mire of this rotting world, and there I stood, the invited speaker at Harvard." Okay, so by this time, Malcolm had gained great notoriety across the world, and he really attributes his redemption to finding real Islam, and he did a pilgrimage to Mecca with a lot of other Muslims, and after finding this true religion and becoming more at peace with himself and with the world and with white people and Black people, he says, "My pilgrimage broadened my scope. It blessed me with a new insight. In 2 weeks in the Holy Land, I saw what I never had seen in 39 years in America. I saw all races, all colors, blue-eyed blondes and black-skinned Africans in the true brotherhood, in unity, living as one, worshiping as one. In the past, yes, I have made sweeping indictments of all white people. I never will be guilty of that again, as I know now that some white people truly are sincere, and that some truly are capable of being brotherly toward a black man. The true Islam has shown me that a blanket indictment of all white people is wrong, just as wrong as when whites make blanket indictments against blacks. Clearly, guys, this is not the philosophy that he had adopted in the Nation of Islam. He made blanket statements against white people in those 12 years, and without really even considering that this was the same thing that they were doing to blacks. So this totally changed Malcolm X's perspective, and it's so unfortunate that it was in the final year of his life, and he did not really get to live out this final chapter of this accepting Malcolm X. And he really attributes this to finding the religion of Islam. And whether it was this or whether it was the education he had, all of these things culminated into somebody who was incredible and who really pushed the issue of injustices that were happening against blacks and black empowerment, guys. And without the steps that he made, we would not be as far as we are today. And of course, with the events that recently happened a couple of weeks ago and with the protests, you see that we are far from where we need to be. But it's guys like this who spoke these words of truth and these words of empowerment that got us to where we are, and his words live on. So these words will continue to live with us as we move forward and continue to guide us. So though far from perfect, Malcolm X fought shamelessly and without filter for what he believed in, guys, and that is to be commended. He did not mince his words. He spoke freely, without concern of any type of negative feelings. He didn't care about anybody's feelings. He spoke out against the oppression that blacks have been facing for years, guys, and to really bring black people up and to make them feel empowered in who they are, rather than feeling negative about who they are because of all the negativity and all of the things in this world that would make them think that they're any lesser than a man or a white man beside him. He brought them up, okay, and these words continue to do that. So I suggest this is a recommended read for anybody. You don't need to be black. It doesn't matter. This is really incredible. What kind of life he lived, how he redeemed himself from the muck, and how he came out of this mire to really help other people as well and to empower people, guys. So one of his final quotes was quite ironically, and unfortunately but quite powerful. He says, "It is a time for martyrs now, and if I am to be one, it will be for the cause of brotherhood. That's the only thing that can save this country, guys." And that was actually 2 days before his assassination. He said, if I can be a martyr, and this is when he had predicted that he was going to die, because he knew the Nation of Islam members were hunting him down after he split from them. And he essentially became bigger than Elijah Muhammad actually ever was. And that created jealousy, and that caused them to hunt down Malcolm. But he was being hunted by them for a while. The FBI didn't take these complaints seriously, and he knew, and he had come to peace with it in a way. So he says, it's a time for martyrs, and if I have to be one, then it's gonna be for the cause of brotherhood, guys. And that's the only thing that will save this country. I think that's a good way to end this one. And it's just powerful words, guys. Go watch his videos of his speeches. Go read the autobiography. And I believe this will help us during this difficult time with continued civil rights issues, guys. They're never gonna be perfect, but all we can do is just keep advancing, taking it day by day, and using perhaps some of Malcolm X's story of redemption to redeem yourself and redeem your heart, and to strengthen you and empower you to move forward in this difficult time, you guys. If you like this episode, please share it with anyone who is also interested in perhaps civil rights, or anyone you think this episode could help to learn about Malcolm X, and especially in the time that we're in. I think it's very important. You can subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. So whether it's Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else. Apple Podcasts actually allows you to leave a rating and a review. So that would be great if you did that. And of course, YouTube allows you to like the video. Share your own ideas or questions as well from the Connect page on the website, insightfulthinkersmedia.com, or in the YouTube comments section. And if you are on the website, check out the blog posts. There are poems and there are articles on there that kind of go with some of the podcasts that we've done in the past. And if you want to join the monthly ITP video conference call, you can support the podcast on Patreon. So this is where we come together each month to have insightful discussions and to analyze topics. It's essentially a video call for myself and you guys to talk about whatever things you want to talk about, whether it's events happening in the present day, and or whether it's about any episodes or any thoughts you've had from the podcast. That's happening through Patreon. Every month we're going to come together and have a video call together, you guys. Other than that, I think that's about everything for today. Thank you guys for tuning into the Insightful Thinkers podcast. This means a lot. I do feel as if every episode is getting better and is getting more concise, succinct, and more clear. And I tell you guys every single time, but I'm so happy to be doing this. Every time I get all set up and ready to go, I'm always very excited. And this is just going to keep going. There's so many topics to discuss, to have a little bit of an in-depth discussion about you guys. And I'm hoping that I can provide something that isn't found anywhere else, frankly. A little bit of an in-depth discussion into a diverse set of topics, you guys. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And we'll be back soon for more in-depth analysis into a diverse set of topics. Take care, everybody, and stay safe.